Hello and welcome to the Wolf Den Podcast, your home for competitive Digimon TCG discussion and news. I'm your host Nako, joined by my co-host Zenitsu. This week, we will be discussing BT11 and the 2022 Digimon National Finals. Listen to us on your favorite podcasting networks, link in the description below, or find us at Wolf Den Digimon TCG.
On top of that, we also stream this live over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, and it's also uploaded as a YouTube video under the YouTube channel of Zenitsu.
For our viewer question of the week, this week's question is, what are your thoughts on there always being a Boogeyman deck in the Digimon TCG?
Well, I think it is a byproduct of just the information that we have from Japan, where they're a couple of sets ahead, usually two to three, and we get to look at some of their data for it. And then basically, when it comes to us, we pick up the pieces and basically kind of continue where they left off, with some changes here or there based on bans and restrictions, based on promo accessibility, and some various other factors. But I don't necessarily think it's bad to have a Boogeyman deck, just because it kind of shapes what the meta is and kind of allows like what decks are playable and what decks aren't, because like some decks just won't have a chance if the top deck is able to beat it most of the time. So you kind of have to like evaluate what you're able to play based on what the theoretical best deck is. And that's kind of where the meta starts to form, at least in our perspective, because we have what Japan thought was their best deck being our starting mindset, which could obviously change.
Yeah, and I think it really speaks to just the limited card pool we have when it comes to deck choice and design, because it's not necessarily that this one deck is decidedly the best deck always. Sometimes it's usually for specific reasons, because if you've got a deck like when Lord Nightmon was really good, it kind of went tall and wide simultaneously, and there weren't any answers to both. You couldn't really get over Lord Nightmon with also not being able to get rid of its wide board state, and they managed to do enough damage in the interim. Like, you would build a Lord Nightmon, you would swing, you would put out a body, either a level 5 ready to go into another Lord Nightmon next turn, or you could, throw a rookie that would either draw you a card or get you some other value someplace, and then they could kill your Lord Nightmon, and then either you could rebuild from the level 5, or you would potentially have another whole cycle ready to go in the back. And that kind of started, like, the Boogeyman deck, yellow, black, or yellow War Greymon also kind of was a Boogeyman to some extent, but we've kind of been rotating these face cards of each set that, when they come out, they define the format, because they do something that is asked of the meta that few decks have answers to, or specific decks have no answers to, and therefore they just are unplayable basically. And it's up to find the decks that can answer the questions. Like, I guess another easy example would be with Melga, how Melga went very hard, very fast, in a level of aggression that most decks just couldn't operate in. Okay, like, you want to play Diaboromon and make a bunch of blockers, that's cool, but before you have a Diaboromon, you've lost the game, and maybe you make a Diaboromon and it makes a token, and that's it, because you either had time to play a Diaboromon or an errata, not both.
I think that's a very fair point. It just really is what the theoretical best deck is doing and then what can answer it. So going into nationals, kind of transitioning into nationals talk, the theoretical boogeyman is Black War Greymon X Antibody or Black War Greymon, whatever you want to label the deck as. But the questions that that deck is asking of the player and the meta is, do you have an out for a large body that can kill your tamers, that also has really good protection against bouncing, tucking, and deletion, effects.
Digivolution even.
It also has protection from de-digivolution and options. Like it's reaching the same type of like levels of protection. That's what made Alphamon look so scary. Is just the amount of coverage it has with the amount of aggression it also could present itself with. Because most Black War Greymon X decks aren't just playing Black War Greymon and Black War Greymon X. They're also spicing it up by playing a mix of Gaiomons for some more de-digivolving and for some more damage, and because Blitz also helps kind of check itself, just because the deck already wants to be like this pseudo control style deck where it can just attack into the opponent's Digimon, get free value, or just utilize Reboot to start getting free value from some of your other inheritables. But just the sheer amount of protection, speed, consistency, and power that the deck has makes it a very scary thing. And a lot of these tamer based decks, they're not able to keep up with it just because of a card like Hades Force that the deck has easy access of. So that kind of pushes a lot of the tamer based decks out of the meta just because of Black War Greymon's existence, because it's like, oh, you're going to sit on a wide field of tamers? Here's a Hades Force. They're all gone now. What else does your deck have to do? Nothing? I guess you just lose that game. And that's the type of like scenario that we're facing with currently. And we've seen multiple different scenarios like this in the past where it's like, okay, what actually does beat this? Is there anything that can beat this? And right now, the answer is yes, there is stuff that beats Black War Greymon. His biggest weakness, we've said this before, is he is weak to battle. Like, he has zero built in battle protection outside of the fact that you might be able to, emphasis on might, be able to make him like 15, maybe 16k at most. And even then, a lot of the decks that want to or can attack directly into Digimon, suspended or unsuspended, doesn't necessarily matter depending on the deck, they can hit those high numbers very easily to be able to delete the Digimon. So it creates this like game of chicken on what is good in this game of chicken, what is able to beat Black War Greymon, and then what is able to go toe to toe with the rest of the field that is also still able to beat Black War Greymon. So that creates this like interesting dynamic on what is playable versus what isn't playable, and that kind of skews our perception based on what we've seen in Japan. But all the only thing we could take away from Japan is there was a lot of Black War Greymons, so we could expect to see a lot of Black War Greymons here.
Yeah, and I think the ultimate point here is that you need to be able to fit in the few pieces of your deck that you have choice to respond to the things that the best deck or the most likely deck, not even necessarily the best deck, the most likely deck, because if 30% of the meta is Black War Greymon or deck X, then you need to make sure that your premier like filler slot, the card slot that isn't 100% committed to a Digimon or a Tamer or something that works as part of your core function of your deck, then you can take that card and dedicate it towards, okay, well, this is my kill card, and in a meta where Black War Greymon is good, I don't want to take Gaia Force as that card, even if I'm playing a red deck, because Gaia Force doesn't do anything against Black War Greymon. I don't want to take, Wyvern's Breath because he can't be DP reduced. I don't want to take um anything that digivolves because he can't be you see the point here is that it's easier to say what you can take than what you can't take. um but this is where something where, like Zenitsu mentioned, the decks that can either targeting unsuspended Digimon with battle or um doing battle damage to Black War Greymon, even though he's like only 1600, that's still pretty big. um if you can get over him and just swing over him, he has no protections against physically being destroyed by battle. It's just he has protection from everything else.
And like, just to kind of list off some of the decks that are capable of doing that, just in case you're curious, like Braid is a fantastic ability to do that do I think Marsmon is going to be the best pick? No, Marsmon and the Birds and Beast deck has some clear problems to it that isn't necessarily something I would feel comfortable with, especially against the rest of the field. But something like Grandis, where it can suspend the opponent's Digimon down and attack into it with piercing, with all these security tech pluses, that's something I would feel more comfortable with taking. Even though they're essentially doing the same thing, my Digimon is killing their Digimon. It's just one has a better output and better consistency on top of a better matchup spread. So, like, you can't always just expect to see Black War Greymon all of the time. You have to understand that other people will play other decks and other decks will be viable, especially the decks that are countering. So some people are even theorizing Security Control might still be good, just because Black War Greymon doesn't necessarily have like the highest DP out, like damage output. So they could like wait the turn or two for the protections to fall off and then option kill it. I think that's still a little on the slow side, considering giving decks an exuberant amount of memory is usually never a good thing, and Black War Greymon does have plays against it, but I digress. But if you're expecting to see a lot of Black War Greymon, a lot of people are expecting to play something like Grandis. Well, now you have your counter to the counter deck in the mix that you then have to think about when it comes to your deck selections. So while I do think something like Examon is good into Black War Greymon, as long as you could get into Examon, does it have a good enough matchup spread across the field? I don't necessarily have the exact answer. I'm not a hardcore Examon main, but that's something you generally would have to think about. And that's kind of like where the whole triangle meta kind of like forms, is that rock, paper, scissors, where you have your one deck on top, which is the Boogeyman. Then you have the deck that beats the Boogeyman, and then you have the deck that loses to the Boogeyman or attempts to try to beat the Boogeyman, but beats what beats the Boogeyman. So that's kind of just the gist on how metas form, and it's going to be interesting to see how Nationals develops with that information. I know PPG ran an event. I know that Grandis won that event. I don't know the rest of the top 8 spread, but that just is an example on how they did a meta call. They picked a deck that also was good against the rest of the field, or the majority of the field, and they didn't see any of their bad matchups, or if they did, they were able to play around them, and they excelled because if the majority of decks they fought were Black War Greymon, well, they just kind of farmed them.
It was a BT11 event.
Yeah, PPG was doing a BT11 Win a Flight deck, or event.
I knew about the event. I wasn't sure the format it was. I mean, I already
It
got all
was
my plans.
it was BT11. I watched
Is
a couple.
BT11 actually out yet?
Yeah, it was literally launch. It was this Saturday. Like
Oh,
launch
okay.
Saturday.
Okay, because I knew the pre-release wasn't. It was kind of weird, but yeah, that
Yeah,
makes sense.
so PPG did it launch Saturday. So people better have had their cards either pre-release or literally the day before, which I think is an awkward time to hold the BT11 event, but competitive players will find a way to get what they want. And maybe part of that data is skewed because they might have used older decks that are not getting many tools from BT11. Like Grandis saw a total of 0 updates. There's no cards in BT11 or even EX3 that deck needs in order to function and operate, and they've just been playing the same deck since BT9.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I
So
also know a couple of other decks are kind of in that same like camp where it's like they don't need any updates, they don't need any cards from BT11, or even if they did, like Examon, it's minimal at best.
hmm Brandis, I think, is in an interesting spot, so we can start there, because I don't think Grandis is kind of like it's not Rookie Rush. It's still an aggressive deck, but it's slower. But it's allowed to be slower because Black War Greymon's a little slower. So if you think of the total, like the scope of what the average game looks like in BT11, it is actually on in general slower than it was in EX2, BT10, etc. EX3, BT10, and really it was just because Melga, being the de facto deck that most people are running with, really kind of like put the heat on anything that was even remotely slower than it, because you had something established, or put some sort of pressure, force them into an incomplete combo or something like that to actually see any result of. If they saw all of their perfect cards exactly when they needed to, you just lost 90% of decks, unless you're playing security control, because it was one of the few decks that could actually like realistically shut them out from security, and then you had more of a game after that. But Black War Greymon, if its one flaw is that, like, when it gets control, it has an absolute iron vice grip on the game, especially if it can put you behind via like a tempo tamer kill or something of that kind, and then it just really just basically prevents you from playing the game like a traditional control deck would, not one that just plays an option card and passes.
Yeah, I definitely think that with Black War Greymon being what he is, it definitely is slowing down the format. I do think like in a matchup like Black War Greymon versus Melga, as long as they're able to basically just get any form of defense, they just stop Melga dead in their tracks half the time, especially since if you have a blocker stack with Black War Greymon and he could redirect, well, that's two instances of protection to basically deal with the opponent's problem before it even comes out of raising. So they have that dynamic to it, and then they also have like the chicken dynamic where it's just like, I don't need to raise my Digimon right away super aggressively. I could hold it back. Like, they could kind of pace themselves based on the different tools that they have access to, because they also still have access to all of like the BT9 Greymon stuff as well, to be able to pace themselves based on what the opponent's thinking of. So like if you want to try to be a more aggressive Black War, then maybe the BT11 Metal X isn't necessarily what you're looking for, and you could use the BT9 Metal X, and that helps put a lot of heat on the opponent. Sure, you lose out on the protection, but if people are running less of those cards to begin with because they're expecting the protection, that just puts things in your favor to apply more pressure. So like there's a lot of like tech options and mental mind games, and this goes into like building your deck and what deck you're going to be running, and not all decks have the availability that to be able to tech themselves as much as Black War Greymon does, just because of all of the support that Greymon as a whole has.
And I guess to finish my thought with Grandis, I didn't, kind of like petered off a little bit there, but to finish my thought with Grandis is that Grandis actually has a slower establishment of what Grandis wants to do, but it also, like Rookie Rush, kind of doesn't care. It does the same thing the same way against 99% of opponents, kind of like, I guess, more so how Melga does than like Rookie Rush, but it it is basically building its own. It's almost a solitaire deck in that aspect, where it's doing what it wants to do. It, like, regardless of opponent's game state, regardless of the opponent's deck, and if they get to their magic number, if they see all their pieces, then they win the game. And if they don't, then they lose the game. It's kind of like, I guess, an Exodia deck in that regard.
Yeah, and you're just relying on the luck of the opponent's security being bad enough, which there's a decent chance it is, in order to
Hmm.
kind of luck sack your way to victory. Like you said, the the strengths are the same. Like the deck's been doing the
Hmm.
same thing that it's been doing with a slower format. It actually has time to be able to do what it's been doing better, just because now that extra time can make it slightly more consistent to be able to get to that desired game state. But it also has the same exact weaknesses, and that's where a lot of these decks like kind of come in and out of the meta, is because of those strengths and weaknesses that they have. Something like Grandis wasn't really super hot in BT10 and EX3 by extension, because Melga just craps on its strategy. It just can't attack into Melga And if Melga can also outspeed it if it finds all of its parts and pieces and doesn't require anything from the opponent either. So that's where it's like, oh, this got pushed out of the meta because Melga was better, but now that Melga isn't better and Black War Greymon is, that allows something like it to come back into the meta, which is the same reason why Jessamon kind of left, and now people are thinking about Jessamon for that same exact reason.
Yeah, and ultimately, what uh Brandis is also kind of playing on is its sole weakness, or I guess like slightly sole weakness, like primary weakness of being weak to security, and decently less so relevant weakness to just being slightly slower than a traditional aggro deck. It but it hides behind the shadow of Black War Greymon and kind of preys upon it because decks are running fewer kill cards because of, or fewer options, period. And Grandis is massive, huge. Like there are no DP level threats that Grandis is scared of, and it it's not scared of option cards as more because people aren't trying to run kill option cards because they don't work against the most common opponent, which is Black War Greymon. So if you're playing Amelga, you're not going to be running a Gaia Force, or Amelga wouldn't work out, but you know what I mean. Like you're not going to run kill cards in your deck if you're not playing one of the big two or the big three. Basically, the whole rest of the sweep of the meta are curving their deck, just as we mentioned in the beginning with the Boogeyman format, with they're curving towards countering and beating as closely as possible Black War Greymon. And so Grandis hides in that shadow and avoids all counter cards that would otherwise completely remove them from the meta.
I I think that's a very true sentiment. And it's not necessarily just limited to Grandis. There's a couple of other decks that do that very well. You have stuff like Mastimon that, even though losing your Mirais, you still actually have the ability to gain them back. And once Mastimon, similar to Black War Greymon, just is able to have an established board state and was able to control, it just forms this vice grip on the game to where it just becomes very, very hard and polarizing, especially with all the new tech that it got, adding more retaliation and more blocker on top of all of the tools that it previously had. And it could even like shift some of its other tech and tools to do various other things, like because now it has more rush, it has retaliation, that just allows it to be able to try to bait out certain plays that it normally wasn't able to. Then you have stuff like Bloomlord, where it just, again, like Mastimon, can form this wide field, can be very good against the meta because it's not playing with a lot of tamers. So Black War Greymon as a whole isn't really going to be that effective for the most part in terms of that part of the effect. And it can suspend the opponent's Digimon, beat it up, and gain enough DP and establish this board state to really swing things into its favor. So it's not just exclusively a Grandis problem, and that's kind of where the meta is going to start forming, is just what decks are playable and how are they playable is the other question that we have to ask.
And not to detract from, again, anyone's success, but it was, I feel like Grandis may be the flash in the pan or the representation that is associated with the marginal chance of it seeing its pieces. If that makes any sense, because even against the best deck, Black War Greymon, if they see their pieces, and there's even some slight delay on the side of a Black War Greymon or whatever deck the Grandis player is playing against, and they see no kill cards in security, then it's a very simple game for them to win. Again, with minimal interaction, just kind of playing their cards on, you know, in the order they play them in every game. Like I was gonna say on curve, but that doesn't really apply here. But um, and then you're gonna have some amount of them that just see all their cards and in all their matches and just do well, or only miss a couple pieces or see a couple things in security. And so it is a deck that you can win with, and it's a very straightforward deck. But just like with Wargray X for BT9/BT10, it may seem better than it is by its results, only because as people see it and win, oh man, like this Grandis beat Black War Greymon, like I gotta play Grandis now. And then they don't, because they saw one of the very binary losing conditions. I saw an opponent that, for some reason, still teched in Gaia Force, or I saw the one Gaia Force that they do play, or I played into Security Control, even though supposedly Black War Greymon, made them extinct, and you just lose then.
And like that's where you have to look at more than just your matchup into the boogeyman. You have to look at the matchup against some of the other playable decks and say, can I really beat that? Because I am also going to be expecting that to be played. As I mentioned before, there's a whole bunch of decks that are playable because of how Black War Greymon is, and the decks that are allowed to be played because of him. And that is just something you have to take into consideration is like, what is my matchup spread? Like, how does Grandis do against Mastimon? Pretty poorly? Well, what's the likelihood of seeing a Mastimon? In the lower
Pretty low.
tables, probably pretty low. At the higher tables, maybe if they're able to continuously beat Black War, it starts getting higher and higher. Same thing with like, how are you against yourself? How are you against some of the other decks that are good against Black War? Like, there's more to think about than just prepping for just the boogeyman when it comes to being able to play your deck, but also just there is a skill in what what tech you're able to put in and want to put in that could easily help propel decks, as we've seen in the past, where it's like these off tech cards could easily swing things into your favor, or vice versa, the opponent's favor.
Yeah. So you touched upon Mastamon. I think Mastamon is also a very good deck for people to consider for BT11 and the general Nats sphere moving forward, because even though it doesn't necessarily have the greatest Black War Greymon matchup, not a lot of these will. Most of them really, I guess, won't. Um, you still have to look at what else people could be playing, and as a result, like, I mean, I would never recommend a deck that would just outwardly 100% lose to Black War Greymon, but I think Mastamon's one of those decks that it isn't super reliant upon its tamer, and even though it is one of the more expensive tamers, that actually kind of works in the favor of Mastamon, because all of their tamer removal is DP based, or cost based, so they they can remove fewer things the more expensive they are. So if you do happen to have out two Mirai, they can pretty much usually only delete one of them, unless they're using Hades Force, but then
And then they
they're
only
using
get two
Hades
of
Force for
them.
two tamers.
Yeah, like Hades Force for two tamers versus Hades Force for like six, or
It's meant for
three and then some
the
Digimon.
hybrid tamer boards where they're killing two 3-cost tamers, one 4-cost tamer, and then maybe a 2-cost tamer.
Yeah, but the other thing is that a lot of decks that rely on their tamers doesn't do, or like, where am I going with this? Oh, yeah. So the thing that Massimon does with Mirai is it isn't 110% reliant on it. It helps it because it gets its free setup, but it could still do what it did in the past. It just will be a little bit more expensive to do without the Mirai setup. And then even if they do lose the Mirai, they do have ways to be able to actually grab the Mirai back, which a lot of these other tamer decks don't have that availability.
Now, um, I think this is something that we actually have struggled with in the last couple sets, but um, I think since this is supposedly the first time we're fully discussing like the intricacies of BT11 decks, it would probably be helpful if we were to take the time to just explain how these decks change. Like, so Grandis didn't gain anything, so we didn't have to reference any specific cards, but could you just go ahead and walk us through like the new cards for the Mastamon deck and how the deck has changed its scope for BT11 moving forward?
Yeah, so give me a second to pull up a database. 'Cause
Because I mean,
I
I know
usually
you and
have
I
one.
both know what Mirai does, but or do we both know what she does?
There
But
we go.
we like it. I mean, even with the competitive mindset in the discussion, we can still at least explain a card that came out a couple days ago.
Right. So Mirai is a five costed purple and yellow tamer. She doesn't have the ability to just set you to a specific memory. Instead, she just generically gains you a memory. So the more Mirais that you have isn't necessarily bad because you'll just passively gain more and more memory for the more Mirais that you have. Then what she's doing for the deck is if you just have one Digimon on the field, Digivolve it into a Angemon or Lady Devimon, she just lets you play another Angemon or Lady Devimon for free, which means if you didn't pass turn, Digivolving into that initial level 5, it's just a free DNA from that point forward into a level 6. Which your level 6 is Mastimon, which we kind of should all know what Mastimon does. She'll just put something from your
There's no
trash
new
back into your
Mastamon.
deck and then play it from your or not deck, put something from your trash into your security, play it, kill something, and then get the on play effect of whatever you just grabbed. So it sets up a very powerful board state, and without Mirai, you had to hard play that other Digimon. Now with Mirai, you don't have to.
Yeah, and I think smaller change, not super um big change, but the new um Lady Devi and the new Anja Woman from BT11 changed the scope of the deck a little bit. I know Mastamon decks in particular are very loose and fast with their level 5s. They would run weird ratios of one of this one, two of this one, two chaos mode, two Loosemon chaos mode, and they would run something like 10 to 12 level 5 sometimes. And basically, they would run fewer of than they could of each, but they would run more level 5s in total so that they had choice when they were pulling from their trash or from what they were trashing, which cards they had access to. And something that the BT11 deck kind of moves away from a little bit with its continued support and its focus is that it really leans more on having a mix of Lady Devis and Anja Womans, and one caring about the other. So anything that isn't Lady Devi or Anja Woman is not as important to this new deck, based that with its interactions with Mirai, but it
I
doesn't
think
completely remove them from the deck. It just the focus is more specifically on them.
yeah, I think still your Tech 1 Chaos mode for Lucimon just for good tamer removal and or large body removal to kind of like stack up your removals is good, and the Angemon, the Magna Angemon from BT1 for that free recovery is still pretty good. But I do think like the new Angemon is just really good because digivolving up into it, you get a recover, and then when you play a when you play a Lady Devimon or Mirai, you get a gain of memory. So if you're using your Mirai to play that Lady Devimon, you're actually now basically being even on your evolution if you're coming off of a Gatomon. And the inheritable that it gives is all of the angels, archangels, or fallen angels will now gain blocker. So that just makes whatever you just played off of your Mastimon even better. And then I know that the Lady Devimon does something similar. You'll gain a memory for playing a Mirai or an Angemon, and then you trash one card from your hand going into this new Lady Devimon to be able to basically recycle a Mirai or an Angel, Archangel, or Fallen Angel. So that's kind of how you're able to reuse your Mirais. And the passive that it gives all of the Angels, Archangels, and Fallen Angels is Retaliation. So the combination of them is actually a very powerful defensive board state where it's like you're going to have blocker and retail on pretty much everything and anything that you're going to be playing. And then the other big inclusion into the deck is going to be Ignitemon, just because you can use Ignitemon as another way to gain even more memory. So in a particular stack, you could actually start gaining memory for evolving, which is just very, very powerful, or just becoming net even, which again is still very powerful because you're basically doing all of these actions for nothing.
Yeah. So, um, one of the other things is with the new Devi and Angemon level 4s. The most of the Mastamon lists we saw kind of started at the level 4. They basically were running like starter Gatomons and then some amount of like Floodgate rookies, but you were almost exclusively just slamming a Gatomon and then digivolving over it for a reduced cost on the following turn. Um, Something that is actually very punishable, unfortunately, especially in today's climate. But um, the new cards introduced give it new ways to get into those level 5s that are usually more efficient than just slamming a Gatomon. And I know, like, it was the one of the events I played in online that I felt really bad when my opponent was a Mastamon and I was playing um, D D Reaper, and I killed my opponent's Gatomon because they gave me so much memory, and I made enough wide bodies that my Starmons would just kill it, and I kind of won the game right there, just because they gave so much tempo away by slamming that Gatomon just for it to die and have nothing to follow it up with was pretty bad. And that weakness is still prevalent in the deck, but they rely significantly less upon their ability to just slam a Gatomon and start a play.
Yeah, I don't think the deck runs the new Angemon. I don't think that card's nearly as good. Like obviously the way Bandai wants us to play it is use the buffs that the new Angemon and Lady Devi are giving it underneath our Mastimon to make that Angemon better. But the reality is it's not getting played at all. But the other card that is getting played is the Devimon, just because he himself will gain rush and retaliation, which is still pretty good.
Kind of filling the off level 4 slot that Black Gatomon filled before, in addition to Gatomon.
Yep. So it because it's also a fallen angel, it's searchable, and it just has a little bit more synergy with the deck because if you like you're obviously going to try to have your Mirai or your Mastimon on the field, which is when the Russian retaliation basically becomes live, is you having a yellow Digimon or a yellow Tamer. So that kind of just benefits how Devimon wants to work.
Yeah. So, um, ultimately though, where what do you see like Mastamon's biggest struggles with um Black War Greymon being? Because we kind of have to relate everything back to Black War Greymon. It's the big bad of the format. It's the deck you're most likely to see across the table at Nats. Um, what do you think is the most important aspect of Mastamon that you have to look out for when playing into Black War Greymon?
It's actually if you can get into Mastimon, to be honest. Like because Mirai is your free setup card, you obviously want to try to use it as best as you possibly can. And without Mirai giving you that free setup, giving you that extra free memory, it becomes significantly harder because, as you mentioned before, Black War Greymon, off of a decent amount of memory for them hard playing a Gatomon, they can just punish the Gatomon, and then that just keeps the Mastimon player from ever getting into Mastimon. And if they can't establish anything, they just lose. But if they are able to get a Mirai to stick or two or even three, then that puts them in the hot seat to actually have some form of comeback because they can get into their desired level 6.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Um, yeah, Black War Greymon isn't nearly as reliant upon Mirai as other decks that run Tamers. Um, it obviously helps to have one. And I think the worst part is trying to get Mirai out.
Yeah,
If you
there's
don't
no
have a
way
way.
for the deck to cheese it out. You just, like Gatomon, gonna have to hard slam and pass. That's the unfortunate reality of it, but or it comes out of security, ideally.
Yeah, because I'm just not 100% sure if it offers enough utility to warrant the 5 mana cost.
I mean, that's your free setup. So, like, Bandai likes to hide their costs. So, the idea behind, oh, playing this Lady Devi is free, but it really isn't because you previously had to pay to play the Mirai, ordinarily, to basically make that action free. They do this all the time with like all force or not all force. Imperial is one of my favorite examples where it's just like, oh, DNAing into your level 5 is free, but it really isn't because you had to hard play the level 4 to DNA. So therefore, the cost of DNA is actually the cost of the level 4. So I think that's kind of similar here. It's just the cost is now reduced because of what Mirai does.
Yeah. So, um, I thought of it last, but I didn't want to like to derail the Mastamon conversation. Another deck that serves perfectly, and I mean, people had asked the question in the past, but um, where did this deck go, and like, why are you running that? And um, the entire idea behind like Minerva Loop and how it was supposedly this such a great deck, great into Cross Hearts, and then just completely fell off the face of the meta was because it was another deck like Grandis, finely tuned, finally occupying a niche in that it did very well into Cross Hearts and in a meta that was expected to be almost exclusively Cross Hearts or all Tamer based decks, Digicross decks, um, and hybrid decks maybe. Then it filled that niche of it did very well into that entire style of deck. So even if it lost to everything else, you'd still play mostly into Cross Hearts, so you still won most of your games.
And I think Minerva is or Merva or yeah, Minerva. God, I get the two confused. Um
Minerva gaining Mervamon.
Yeah, I think like it was in that waiting room where it was just waiting for the other half, like literally the other card that it was referencing in order to kind of complete what the deck was trying to do and give it the extra utility that it needed. And then now here we are with Mervamon, and I actually think it still can do very, very well because it's another deck that doesn't necessarily hardcore rely on tamers. Don't get me wrong, the cool boys help or whatever tamer you're running will help, but you're not solely reliant on it. You're more reliant on what the combo is and your extra play lines available because of how Mervamon is playing with Minervamon. And because Black War Greymon is a single stack deck for the most part, it's not going to have more than two Digimon on the field unless it's like actually dominating hardcore to turn off your Minerva's ability to be able to spawn that extra free body, which ideally should be that Mervamon. And if you're unfamiliar with what Mervamon does, Mervamon basically on play or when digivolving, so you have that utility on how you could use it. You basically just get to play a level 4 or lower purple Digimon or a Cross Hearts. You're primarily a purple deck, so you're just going to be playing your purple Digimon. And if you digicrossed using this card, which means if you hard played it and then digicrossed using its Digicross 3 ability to make it from a 11 cost to a 7 cost, or no, 11 cost to an 8 cost, I can't do math, then you get to play an extra body at the fact that you had to hard play it, but you are hard playing it off of your Minerva, so it's not like that's actually a cost. And then she has this passive to give all of your Cross Hearts and Retaliation Digimon Rush and Blocker, so you have all of that extra utility on top of a slew of new Retaliation Digimon that deck can now interact with, like Dark Lizardmon, which is basically doing almost the exact same thing as Eismon Scatter Mode. It just doesn't draw you as much and it doesn't trash as much, but it still has that on delete ability while also having Retaliation to then interact with your Minerva or your Mervamon. So like it just got a lot of extra parts and pieces to kind of complete what the deck is trying to do. And you don't necessarily have to build it in that particular way. Most people are because that's like the most explosive way that it can do anything out of nothing and be able to sneak in games because of how explosive it can be.
Yeah, it kind of occupies the niche that uh, Melga had, where it pretty much just kind of wants to do its thing. It's a very aggressive deck once it has its pieces. It's still a little slower, which again, without Melga being the omnipresent force that it was, you'll have on average more time to set up than you did last format. And one of the things that it does really well is it actually plays better into decks that aren't. So I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say like ABC, but it having retaliation and functioning around retaliation and having like going back to Minervamon specifically, the BT10 card that was it's also the like the secondary face card. Um, Minervamon allows you to whenever an opponent plays a Digimon, you can play a level 4 lower purple card from your trash without paying its memory cost. And that functions into a lot of deck strategies. Something like Bloom Lord, that has been touted as potentially a good deck into Black War Greymon, hard plays many Digimon that would all be immediately responded with a hard play by the Minervamon, allowing them to set up for lethal and put pressure on a deck that takes maybe even longer to set up than Minerva does.
That yeah, that's a on top of still being good into cross decks, because cross decks, they aren't necessarily as super good because of Black War and all of the tamer hate that he brings, but they play so many tamers that sometimes, like, they still will have tamers to spare even when Black War attempts to try to delete all of their tamers. And because of their new tamer, that just helps them set up and gains the memory and gives them card draw and allows them to digicross easier. It just does so much for the deck that, like, it still has legs even in a format against Black War, but that's where Minerva still kind of occupies the same space it did last time, where it's like, yeah, it still can prey upon those decks as well.
Yeah, I think they definitely are going to struggle. Anyone playing, I think anyone bringing Cross Hearts knows they're not necessarily the favored, especially in a format that's supposedly going to be dominated by a tamer hate deck. I think anyone looking to play a Cross Hearts deck is probably trying to capitalize on the fact that nobody really played into Cross Hearts because as soon as it came out, it got nerfed to the ground. So people, unless they did any preemptive BT10 playtesting, then they weren't super familiar with exactly the the reach that Cross Hearts has. And that's one of the things that is struggled or like ways you could lose to Cross Hearts is if you underestimate their capabilities or think you're safe when you're not, or you overplay something that can get removed and you find yourself in a disadvantageous position as a result of that.
Like, Cross Hearts actually now, with its BT11 update, has a lot more versatility than it ever had before, because literally in BT10, you just had whatever was there and that was it, with a little cards here and there sprinkled from some other sets. But now, with BT11, you actually get a breadth of new cards and a breadth of new ways to approach the deck. So you could approach the deck from the old Shout 5 build, and you could be more aggressive with some of your cards, like adding Shoutmon and Star Sword as another Shoutmon to Digicross with to gain the rush to poke, and then put the rush Shoutmon back underneath your Tamer while still having a good on play effect. Then you also have the budget replacement to Cross 4, which is Cross 3, requires less pieces, easier to use, still digging, and if it sticks around, then you could potentially use its ability to passively gain some extra memory at the cost of the body. But with him having material save, you could still try to save some of the material underneath to be able to utilize them for various other things while gaining that memory and tempo. So that's like one approach you could take with it. Then you have the Cross 7 build, which the Cross 7 kind of has his own little sub package of cards to work around. So Shout 7, basically with all of the Digicrosses, because there's a lot of them, he's going to basically be a level 6 that's 2 to hard play, kill something when he comes in, and is a really big boy with Rush. Material save 4, so 4 of his 6 materials are going to be saved when he goes away. And he has pretty high stats on top of good offensive and defensive capabilities, thanks to Zeke. I always want to say Zeke Greymon, but it's Zeech Greymon. Because Zeech Greymon will give him blocker, then the new Omni Shout will give him security attack plus, and that just allows him to do a lot of pressure while having alternative lines of play to be able to utilize those cards as well. And then you have the Minerva build, or the Merva build, where it's kind of like Shout 5, except you're just trying to rely on Mervamon's cross ability to be able to play two bodies and swing with them right away. And you're just going to be playing a whole bunch of ways to be able to gain memory, to be able to make playing Merva and not passing turn possible. So, like, there's just a lot of flexibility. Like, just because they flip over Starmonts doesn't necessarily mean you know exactly what they're going to be running.
Yeah, it's something that I think the lines of play are at least easy enough to discern once you played against them a couple times. It's not the hardest to figure out which direction they're going with based on which cards that the other builds don't run, more or less. Um, but it at least gives Crossheart players an option to mix up the fact that they're playing a Tamer-based deck into a format dominated by Tamer hate. Almost exclusively by Tamer hate.
Yeah, that's kind of where I think, like, the Merva build is actually probably right now the more desired one. Not just because she's a waifu, but because she's relying less on the Tamers. And the Tamers are more impactful in the early game than they are in the late game, just because you're not just saving materials. Instead, she's actually utilizing the trash and bringing materials back. So it's like that's kind of where deciding what you're trying to tech for and against gives decks with a lot more support advantage over other decks.
Yeah. Um, Other than that, I don't. Is there anything like we're absolutely missing? I'm trying to think.
I mean,
Um,
Blue Flares has gotten better. Like, there's a lot of decks that got better.
isn't the
Unfortunately,
premier blue flare deck like a blue flare crossheart combination? Like
uh,
show 7?
no,
It's not really a blue flare deck. It's a crossheart deck that runs blue flare pieces.
no. Blue Flares wants to use Zeech Greymon just because how they can use Zeech Greymon is basically a free evolution. Because he digivolves for 2 on top of a Metal Greymon. So you literally are just like, okay, Metal Greymon is gonna swing. Um, you even have Metal Greymon and Plasma Launcher as a new card in the set to act as another Metal Greymon and still have that armor purge ability so you could be aggressive with. Like, it shifts the deck to be a lot more aggressive, where it's just like, okay, Metal Greymon, swing, then Digivolve into Zeech Greymon for 0 because he's going to unsuspend himself, gain the 2 memory back for Digivolving on top of a Blue Flare Digimon, which means there's a Blue Flare in his source. And then he has the on delete ability to save, plus adding a Greymon and Male Bertramon to then set up another Metal Greymon. So, like, it is just trying to loop and use your Metal Greymons, and it doesn't necessarily require or need the opponent to have 2 or more Digimon in play in order to function and operate, which was its big weakness. I mean, it helps if they have it, but now that they don't, you have extra lines of play because you could also think about spicing up the deck and build and running something like Metal Greymon X Antibody from BT9 just because it's a red Digimon that could Digivolve on top of your blue Metal Greymon, and because Zeech Greymon Digivolves also on top of red, there's that extra usability. You'll only be gaining, it'll be a 1 Evo instead of a 0 Evo, but still, like, there's lots of different things that Blue Flares can do to accommodate for its weakness with these new tech and tools.
Yeah. Um, I'm just looking through here. The one of the big out things we never mentioned was Ulforce. Ulforce seems to be a very strong presence, and honestly, the one to consider if you take each deck and you assume only their matchups against each other, not including Black War Greymon, it's probably the deck to beat. So if you're not playing Black War Greymon, um, it's something maybe you should really practice for and consider because the non-Black War Greymon decks are going to struggle significantly more if they don't have a source of readily available Tamer removal. Because my word, does this deck really go off if they see what they need?
Oh my god. I wholeheartedly agree that I think All Force would be that new big bad blue deck if Black War Greymon didn't exist to basically curb stomp it into the ground, because oh my god, that matchup is so negative for Ulforce into Black War Greymon that it's almost kind of hysterically sad. I mean, obviously, bricking aside, like if everyone finds their most optimal lines, optimal pieces, yada yada yada, um, Ulforce has almost zero chance against Black War Greymon. But against almost literally everything else, it is really good and it's really positive. So, like, there's that caveat of, like, what do I want to bring into the expected meta? Like, if I'm expecting 60, just throwing out a number, 60% to be Black War Greymons, well, that means now Ulforce is going to be losing 60% of the time because of the times that they see Black War Greymon, which puts it in a really bad position to want to take because of the supposed prevalence of Black War Greymon. But yeah, if Black War Greymon didn't exist, I definitely think Ulforce is probably the deck.
Could you just, because you have more experience with it than I do, just rattle real quick the main combo of Ulforce and why it is as dangerous as we are suggesting it is.
So the main combo of Ulforce is literally its interaction between Ulforce and Rena. So a lot of the pieces in Ulforce are basically just supporting tamers, digging out your tamers, just all of your setup. Just going up the chain is just 100% setup. And then when you get into Ulforce, you're going to Digivolve them and then play a tamer for free, which then gives you memory because you ideally are going to be gaining memory from playing your tamer from all of your inheritables. So that's essentially reducing the cost of going into your higher level Digimon. So if you have enough tamers, or the tamer that you play could make him free, then that's where the true power of Ulforce comes, is just how cheap it is to get up into him. But not only that, when you just for digivolving into him, you're going to be playing that tamer, gaining the memory from your inheritables, and then when you play that tamer, you're going to unsuspend this Digimon. So the level 5 wants to be suspended to utilize his ability. So you're going, whether you're actually being aggressive with a different level 5 is all depending on how, like, the cards that you see. But you're going to be unsuspending him so he can multi attack and gain extra utility. And then on top of that, he's going to be bouncing the opponent's Digimon per tamer. So the more tamers you have, the stronger the bounce effect becomes. So it's going to start off with level 3 by default, then one tamer. He's going to be able to bounce level 4, two tamers, bounce to level 5, and then so on and so forth. But the thing that Rena is doing in combination with Ulforce is one, on play, it's giving it blocker and evade. So there's your defensive lines of play, and there's your protection. And then two, during all turns, your Vidramons, when it becomes suspended, you get when it becomes suspended, you get to suspend this tamer to activate its Wind Digivolving ability again, which means with Ulforce, you get to play another tamer. Which, if it's another Rena, you get a loop and kind of just basically unsuspend that Ulforce, get another attack, play the Rena, get the Wind Digivolving and on-play abilities to basically just go over and over again, and be able to kill the opponent that way. And then on top of all of that, she also is going to be helping you gain some memory. When your Digimon becomes unsuspended, gain a memory. So, like, it's just a lot of compounding factors between how the line is and what Rena and Ulforce is doing to basically do what the old one is doing, and just multi-swing to try to kill the opponent while removing the opponent's Digimon while having some good abilities on himself.
Yeah. Um, there's a lot this deck can do that all with looping its tamers and unsuspending and reusing its undigivolving effect. It just it kind of does fall flat if it gets its key pieces removed, unfortunately. And again, with Black War Greymon just being so present, it really just it because it's the deck that the only deck that maybe has any legs left outside of Cross Hearts. But Cross Hearts is more of a dark horse at this point. You're not playing Cross Hearts because it's meta. You're playing Cross Hearts because nobody knows how to play into Cross Hearts necessarily. They just assume that no one's gonna play it because of Black War Greymon, and maybe you like the anime or something. But um, one of the it's one of the decks that really, like, outside of Hades Force, is a threat and a deck to be reckoned with, and you really are kind of on a clock more so than with a lot of these other decks that we've mentioned, that it plays a lot faster. Like I guess more like Mervamon at the speed that like the Minerva loop plays, because it only needs to see a couple pieces and get into. And each turn is a tempo based initiative, even while doing tamer based things and playing things out. It really gets going, and it really becomes like, because it kind of all like feeds back into itself. If you don't get rid of its tamers for some reason, and also don't lose the game for some reason, it just gets worse for you.
Yeah, and that is like the scary thing about All Force is just how much the deck can do and how intricate its lines of play are depending on the combo that you're setting up and the different types of tamers that you have. Because like I've seen All Force do like a lot of different things, and when I mean a lot of different things, I mean a lot of different things. So just going over like all of the sub variants that I've seen the deck do, you have All Force running the Bond package because it could set up your Bond tamers and you don't necessarily need all of the low level VMons. You have it playing around with the hybrid package. So you're playing with tamers already, spawning them for free. Makes sense that you could also think about running hybrids to tempo into your All Force and still be like super powerful, oppressive, and controlling when you need to, depending on the hybrid package that you're playing around with. Then you have the Leomon package as another package that you could lean into, just because you do have Jerry that on play plays a Leomon. You play the EX2 Leomon that has a blocker and on delete ability to draw you a card and gain 2 memory. So that just that synergy alone can set you up into a very powerful board state. Then you have the Gao package, just because, Galmon's also playing with Tamers. It's not the best out of the packages, but it's something I have seen before. And then you have the Pure V package, which literally is exactly as it sounds. You're just playing all Vmons, all Vidramons, and you're just going all in on that type of synergy to try to support All Force the best you can with his native tools.
Um, yeah, still going over things. Like there are a lot of decks that were introduced in this that aren't necessarily worth talking about. Like
Bagra's still
I feel like
Bagra, it's still bad.
we
Poop
still
is a
mentioned a lot
meme.
of decks. No, Poop Tribal is. We have to mention Poop Tribal. You can't make Poop Tribal and not discuss it.
I It's funny. I honestly think Machine Dramon has more viability than Poop Tribal.
Well, Machines got more sets worth of support. We need like the third wave of Poop Tribal support.
Uh
We need
BT
Toilet
13.
Mon.
Yeah, BT 13.
So, um, yeah. Other than that, there's not a whole lot going on. Um, the decks that we mentioned that were good, they either get new support or stay good. Um, Melga still exists. It still has a place technically for out tempoing uh Black War Greymon, but it already kind of technically lost to Black War Greymon as far back as like BT8, BT9. It just always was faster pretty much. Like there were zero ways, and the comeback tools weren't as comebacky. But so if you managed to set up a Black War Greymon against Melga before, it wasn't the end of the world for them. Now it kind of is. So
Yeah, the different forms of bounce protection on top of the extra forms of defense to stop the attacks on the security. Like it is kind of like where Examon is against Black War Greymon, where it's just like if Examon could get into Examon before Black War Greymon can set up, Examon's probably going to win that matchup just because now it is forcing the Black War Greymon player to come out of their comfort zone and play a game they don't want to play. And Black War Greymon for Melga does the exact same thing, where it's like if I could get into a Black War Greymon X, or even just a normal Black War Greymon, just being able to multi-block and stop a lot of the pressure is basically the straw that breaks the camel's back in that type of a matchup. But again, because the format is warping around Black War Greymon, Melga still has that existence spot similar to Security Control, where it could feed off of the decks that do well into Black War Greymon because it beat all of those decks previously, so it should still beat all of those decks now.
yeah, and especially the ones that are trying to take advantage of the slower format in general, um, it would really just come down to your um, handle on the Blackrock Greymon matchup. How long have you been playing? And it's something I know we've seen in the past at the beginning of formats where people will take either the best deck or one of the better decks of the previous format with minimal, if any, changes and just perform well because the deck on paper still can do X, Y, and Z. I mean, I know it was Imperial moving into BT9 and Black War or Wargrey X moving into BT10. We had these decks that still had legs, assuming they had a person who had been playing the deck maybe a little longer than their opponent had been playing their deck and had more practice and therefore worked their way out of some less than ideal situations, all because they were still playing something that they were familiar with.
Yeah, and I think like part of the problem on like what makes All Force a little bit harder to want to get into, kind of backtracking a little bit, is just the fact that Rena is a secret rare and you need 4 of it, and that's why you're probably also less likely to see Galactimon. One, because Galactimon does lose to
Bad,
Black War.
because it's
Literally
bad.
just, hey, you have a Galactimon? Cool, Digivolve. Now your entire strategy is ruined. That's definitely a thing. On top of the fact that in like just the booster box opening experience, secrets are actually harder to pull in this set than in any other set before it. Period. Like you are actually getting less secrets. And now that because each of these secrets you need 4 of, that just makes it harder to get into from a booster box opening experience. Any competitive player is just going to buy singles, but inversely, with that knowledge, singles are also going to be a little bit more expensive for those decks more specifically.
So I guess I haven't gotten able to open any product yet. What makes the secrets harder to pull this set?
So as
Do they
uh
occupy like the is the secret slot occupied by a campaign rare?
no,
Are
there's
there any
just
secret campaign rares?
no, there's no secret campaign rares. I don't exactly know 100% what is eating up those slots. If I had to take a guess, it is just the increased amount of alt arts because this set doesn't have any box toppers, which means all of the tamers that they were using, they're alt arts inside of the set. So that's some additional alt arts that are then being eaten up, like eating up those secret rare slots. Yeah, at least like from my perspective, where those would be. The campaign rares I think are eating up at the SR slots because you're also seeing less SRs per box as well. Your average SRs was 7 per box, and now it's 6 per box, which means in a case that's 12 less SRs. Your average for secrets was 10, split between alt arts and base rares. Usually the base rares you get 4 of each on average. Again, math and variance is a thing. And then you're usually likely to see like 2 alt arts of each. And now it's literally 2 and 2. And then if you're lucky, you can see 2 secrets, like secret alt arts. Again, variance is a thing, and you might see a little bit more secret alt arts or a little bit less. But the fact that your average is still like 5 to 7, rounding just evenly at 6, means that you're going to see less secrets on as a whole. So there's just a lot of things wrong with this set because rares are also harder to get because the foil commons and uncommons are eating at those slots as well. So now you're getting more chaff cards just to try to bling out your commons, which, whatever. Looking at the secondary market, literally has almost zero impact on the cards. I could get the foils for 25 cents and I could get the base rares for 10, 15 cents or even 25 cents. So it's like it literally didn't do anything. Um, and
So
it's just the few decks that like those more sought after cards people would want to bling it out for.
I hate to derail your observations, but I think you're just mathematically wrong only because you're right that the tamers occupy the altart slot where previously they were box toppers, but those are in addition to, not except from. So if you look at BT10 and how many altarts BT10 had, BT10 had one, two, three, four, five.
I mean, I don't know
It
100%
had
what's
20
eating.
altarts in total, two of them being secret, and the box toppers. So it had 20 alt arts and then 2 alt arts, or 18 plus 2, so 20 alt arts total, 2 of them being the alt art secrets. BT11 included fewer alt arts actually, in even counting the tamers. 2, 3, 4, 5.
It could also be the campaign rares eating
Yeah,
up those slots
it's
as
only
well.
18. So
Yeah, like
BT11 actually has fewer parallel arts physically, even counting the tamers. So without a campaign rare eating a secret slash alt slot, it should have more even proportionately. Maybe not like enough to actually be worth one mathematically. Like you won't, or like you're not gonna, because it would always round down. It would never round up, but you would still see on average the same amount of alt arts slash secrets in a case than you would previously. So maybe you just saw more alt arts than secrets just by happenstance.
no, I asked around and other people had the same result as me when opening up their cases. So it is not just a me case alone situation. There actually is less secret rares being opened up. Again, I don't know if it's because of the campaign rares, because the campaign rares last time were eating up a rare slot. Now they're not eating up a rare slot. They're actually probably eating up a secret super slash alt art slot. And then on top of that, I noticed that there was some clumping issues with the alt arts, where certain alt arts like to be paired up together. So in a booster box, when you open up, let's just say a Angelmon, there's a very high likelihood your other alt art is going to be a Lady Devimon. I noticed that like with a couple of other pairs, but I don't know if it's a case by case basis when what gets paired up with what. But regardless, there is some funky clumping going on as well.
Seeding issues, yeah.
Yeah, which we've seen seating issues in the past as well, but
BT4 was very seeded. It was basically you either got like box A, box B, or box C.
yeah,
Based
it's
based on like you could literally put 2 supers on the table and I could tell you the rest of the supers in that box without opening the packs. It's ridiculous.
yeah, but like seating aside towards the alt arts, this set was just very scuffed to open, as a whole, just because there was a literally I was sorting out my cards earlier and I noticed just how many more commons and uncommons there were in this set specifically than any other set that I've pulled from. Just because I sort and organize my cards in a very particular way, counting how many rows it takes up in a 4 row, and I was just like, wow, there is more chaff in this than in previous sets, which is weird.
Yeah.
Just because
It's
of
I
those
mean,
foil commons and uncommons also adding to that.
that's unfortunate, but it's kind of like a first world problem. Man, I
I
have
mean, I mean,
too many
yes,
cards.
yes, it
Like
is,
for
but
the
I,
average person opening a box or two, they're gonna see like maybe slightly higher of the lower rarities than they saw before, maybe slightly less of the higher, or slightly more of the lower rarities, slightly less of the higher rarities. But ultimately, they still need to buy singles to fill out what they need if they're buying boxes at all. Again, ultimately, like buying singles is your best sort unless you're someone who needs to buy cards to play in a national tournament, like in like a week or so. Then by all means, go on TCG Player, go on your favorite source of sourcing cards, and buy your 2 4 ofs, whatever need be, and it'll be cheaper in the long run because Digimon's still the cheapest card game, right? You know, you could still buy a full unfoiled, or unaltered Black War Greymon deck for cheaper than the price of the cheapest Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic, or Pokemon deck.
yeah, but going back to some of the booster box problems, which is kind of weird because like this is this they probably knew that the set was scuffed to open, which is why they released it so close to nationals. Just like how they probably knew BT10 was pretty bad as well, which is why they overstuffed it with like supplementary stuff and extra stuff to try to entice people to buy more of it. This kind of feels like that part two, except even worse because now we have to open more boxes than we normally did, which increases how many commons and uncommons and all that stuff get flooded into the market. while we're all hunting for the higher rarity cards. Like I counted in my case, or like in my booster box, you get 23 rares and 13 foil commons and uncommons. So if you look at the set's ratios, there's 26 different rares in the set, which means one box isn't going to give you all at least one of all of the rares, which then if you're missing one of those off rares and you usually buy something like 4 boxes, you're no longer going to have that accessibility to be able to get what you need in your usual allotted amount that you would normally buy, which then creates like player discontent and it feels really bad. And that's kind of like how I felt opening up my case. I usually know and feel very safe opening up cases because I know the standard ratios, and this completely destroyed like my expectations on how bad it was. And this was right before nationals too. So if I literally was planning on playing something like All Force, and I only saw out of my case 3 arenas, I'd be very upset. But thankfully, I'm not
Yeah,
playing All Force, just because of the reasons we
I
talked
think
about.
um BT11 looks to be something. We'll have more thoughts after we have more experience with it in Nats. Good luck to all of those also making their way down to Los Angeles to participate with me. It should be a fun experience nonetheless. Still no idea what I'm taking yet. Lots of last minute play testing to get underway. Though unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this week. Do you have any last thoughts, Zenitsu?
No. Outside of the fact that, like Nako, I'm also going to be there. I wish everyone luck, and I'm still also undecided. I think I narrowed it down to like 2 decks, but still doing some last minute play testing to really try to round things out and figure that out. But I wish everyone luck, and I hope everyone watches closely, as BT11 is definitely going to be a very interesting meta to see how it develops.
Yeah, I hope my thoughts and my read on the meta from the internal playtesting and some perceptions I have aren't necessarily true. We'll have to see how the results actually play out. But with that, goodbye.
Later.